It looks like Miami could be the last time we see the Mercedes ZeroPod design, or at least the extreme version we've become used to. The Imola upgrades are coming. Before we get into the upgrades, we need to understand the problems Mercedes are facing. Since 2022, they've gone with a ZeroPod design as it's been known, and they've struggled. But as it's been explained many times before, the Sidepods don't tell the whole story. It's just something people latch onto. 2022 and 2023 cars rely heavily on the floors and the Venturi tunnels to get their downforce. The Sidepod design plays a part in the aerodynamic concept, of course it does, but it's not as straightforward as that. The floor is actually the most important part of these new cars. Red Bull has some interesting tricks when it comes to their floor, shrinking the gearbox to give extra diffuser room, something Mercedes are unable to do mid-season, or maybe even for next season. The other thing to consider is that chassis changes are not realistic mid-season, due to the cost cap. Think of the chassis as the base structure that everything else, including the engine, bolts onto. There's been talk that the Mercedes driving position is too far forward for Lewis Hamilton's liking, and it gives him a weird feeling in the car. But this is not something that can be changed mid-season, as it would require an entirely different chassis. So what are Mercedes bringing? Well, Toto Wollf thankfully has given us a good idea of what to expect after speaking to motorsport.com, and it's a lot. He said, "We are introducing new bodywork, new underbody and new front suspension, which is quite important. It is quite a large operation, a large intervention. There'll be a lot to learn and look for correlation from visual simulations, where our time on the lap is good." He was quick to temper expectations though, saying, "We have to manage our expectations, because we will be bringing an upgrade package to Imola which will consist of new suspension parts, bodywork and other things. But in my 15-year Formula 1 career, I've never seen something introduced that suddenly unlocks half a second of performance, so I highly doubt that will happen to us this year." It seems as though these upgrades are not just about taking Mercedes in the right direction this year, but also setting a baseline for them to work on for next year. Toto also had this to say, "For this reason, the update we are bringing will help us define the direction we take for next year and understand the various areas that we believe may play a role in why the car is so poisonous to drive." Now that's a pretty interesting thing to say, and he said it quite a few times. The Mercedes is very difficult to drive. As we know, Aston Martin have been ahead of Mercedes this season, and Mercedes know that Aston Martin use their rear suspension, gearbox and engine. That alone tells you that they have room to grow. The front suspension is one area they hope to improve on, and it's an area that Aston Martin has developed themselves. It's one of the big changes between their cars, not including obviously the aerodynamic sidepod differences. The floor, on the other hand, is one of the key areas of the new regulations for downforce, and if Mercedes want to change their concept, including their sidepods, it's a whole change of floor as well. It's possible that's one of the reasons the front suspension is changing, to condition the flow towards a potentially reshaped sidepod area. Toto never actually used the word sidepods, he was very clever in his words. He simply said bodywork, but it's certainly assumed that a reshaping of the sidepods is on the agenda, but it's not something that's going to suddenly make them run at the front of the grid. What it may do though is give them a more stable race car. As we've seen so far this season, the W14 is incredibly inconsistent. It sometimes comes alive in a race, but often in qualifying it's off the pace, and both drivers have stressed how difficult it is to drive, often on the edge. Some race weekends they've been closer to the front, and others they're struggling to get out of Q2. You'd have to assume that if the car can be tamed and become more stable, that in itself will give the drivers more confidence to push. It definitely seems like we could be seeing the end of the ZeroPod design, so goodbye ZeroPods. You were an incredible feat of engineering, but I doubt Mercedes fans will miss you all that much.